So this is the first chapter on the science of human development. And of course, since it's a science, we're going to use scientific methods to demonstrate our assertion that development is a scientific pursuit. One of the difficulties right off the bat is defining what development is. The science of human development seeks to understand how people and why people of all ages and circumstances change or remain the same over time. Defining development also includes at least 5 different facets. It's multidirectional, that is, development happens in many planes. It's multi-contextual, that is, that it happens in many different contexts. It's multicultural, occurring differently in different cultures. It includes a multidisciplinary approach, and it is plastic, meaning that it changes. Understanding how and why happens by the use of the scientific method, which is a way to answer questions that require empirical research and data-based conclusions. So we're not going to talk about things the way our aunts or grandparents might have. We're going to try to base our decisions on research. And there are basically 5 steps in the scientific method, beginning with curiosity and posing a question that we want to study, developing a hypothesis, which is an assumption about where things may be developing, testing that hypothesis through scientific principles, drawing conclusions, and reporting our results, which is really a very important part of the whole process. The scientific method is a 6th and crucial step-by-step replication is often needed before the scientific community accepts conclusions. So for example, the difference between peer-reviewed research and non-peer-reviewed is what is part of this crucial step. And that's replication. Can I repeat if I repeat the study, do I get the same conclusions every time, especially if I'm using different participants? Of course, there are issues that come up, and they come up all the time, including the nature-nurture debate. Nature, of course, being the general term for traits, capacities, and limitations that each individual inherits genetically from his or her parents at the moment of conception. And nurture being the general term for all environmental influences that affect development after an individual is conceived. And of course, we know that this is kind of a moot debate because you can't have one without the other. And of course, epigenetics refers to the confluence of both of these. One of the things that developmental psychologists do is they take a lifespan perspective. They approach the study of human development that takes into account all the phases of life, not just childhood or adulthood. The lifespan perspective is multi-directional. Over time, humans' characteristics change in every direction. Several major theorists describe stages of development as a discontinuous process. They include Sigmund Freud, Erik Erikson, and John Piaget. Others view development as a continuous process. The lifespan perspective is multi-directional. There are critical periods in which development must happen, as opposed to sensitive periods when it's more of an optimum time. So time when a particular type of developmental growth, body or behavior, must happen if it's ever going to happen, like language. A sensitive period, on the other hand, is a time when a certain type of development is most likely to happen or happens most easily, although it may still happen later with more difficulty, like language. The lifespan perspective is also ecologically based system, that it happens in a context and an environment. In the study of human development, the person should be considered in all the contexts and interactions that constitute a life. Development is multi-contextual. Development being multi-contextual, like Bronfenbrenner, who talked about ecological systems. Each person is affected by many social contexts and interpersonal interactions. Just think of, even within your own family, how if you have younger or older siblings, how the different contexts of just being raised by your parents varies even over the course of a decade. And of course, the ecological model depicted here is pretty complex. The lifespan perspective looks at people over the lifespan from conception to death. Development is multi-contextual historical context. For example, cohorts, persons born at the same or within a few years of each other, and they share many characteristics. For example, like the baby boomers or Gen Xers. They often share the same attitudes about things like same-sex marriage. Even the socioeconomic context, that is, the environmental effects of economics and world trade, for example, is affected by national and historical contexts. Think of it this way. Here's an example. So people living today, that are born now, have never known a period of their life when computers haven't been and cell phones haven't been just a mainstay in modern culture. Is more critical in some jurisdictions than others. So, for example, the use of cell phones in sub-Saharan Africa is very different than it is in Western cultures like the United States and Canada. It includes pervasive context of the socioeconomic status, that is, wealth and income. So that is another type of context. Socioeconomic status, by the way, is a person's position in society is determined by wealth and income, how much money you make and how much you accumulate, your occupation, your education, and the place that you live at. Culture is super important. Culture is the patterns of behavior passed from one generation to the next, primarily through language. And it's considered to be a social construction. That is, we make it up as we go. And many factors and forces make that context up. Their ideas based on shared perceptions, not objective reality. And many age-related terms such as childhood, adolescence, yuppie, senior citizen are really social constructs of Western societies that may not occur in other societies. And this just gives the a layout of socioeconomic status, the light blue being the more advanced, the dark blue being the least developed. And you'll notice that there are geographic disparities. Development is multicultural. Differences equals deficits error. Mistaking beliefs that deviations from some norm is necessarily inferior to behavior or characteristics that meet the standard. So we tend to be ethnocentric in the United States, believing that because we have the standard of living we have, that we're better off. Lev Vygotsky, a Russian developmental psychologist, for example, did what he called guided participation. It's a universal process used by mentors to teach cultural knowledge, skills, and habits. So if you grew up on a farm in the Midwest in the 1930s, you were guided into being a farmer by aunts, uncles, grandparents. They taught you the way. This can occur through school instruction, but more often it happens informally. So the time that you spend with your grandmother making bread or your grandfather working on a car is informal instruction, and it entails culturally different goals. Lifespan perspective includes ethnicity, which is a social group you grew up in, shared values, race, which is primarily based on biological differences, and of course culture, which we just talked about. Development is multidisciplinary. All important human characteristics are epigenetic, that is, referring to the effects of environmental forces on the expression of an individual or species' genetic inheritance. So you may have certain genetic characteristics, and depending on the environment you grow up in, they may be or not be expressed. Some epigenetic influences impede development, others facilitate it. For example, diet. And of course, lastly, development is plastic. That is, it is malleable. Plastic denotes two complementary aspects of development. Human traits can be molded, like plastic, that's why it's called that. And people maintain a certain durability of identity. So there's forces of change and there's forces of stability. Dynamic systems, human development is viewed as an ongoing, ever-changing interaction between physical and emotional forces. This dynamic systems approach builds on the multidirectional, multi-contextual, multicultural, and multidisciplinary nature of development. It urges consideration of all the interrelated aspects, every social and cultural factor over days, years, and even centuries. Plasticity emphasizes that people can and do change, that predictions are not always accurate. More accurate predictions could improve prevention of developmental problems, but of course those are really hard to predict. 3 insights advance benefits of prediction. They include the nature-nurture debate, the sensitive periods, which we just talked about, and differential sensitivity. Using the scientific method, you do scientific observations first, which requires the researcher to record behavior systematically and objectively. It may be done in a naturalistic setting, such as a home, school, or public place, or a laboratory. And statistics are the way that we measure those things. They include things like the effect size, that how powerful the response we get is. Is it significant or not? Is there a cost-benefit analysis? That is, does what it costs outweigh or underweigh the benefits? Odds ratios, factor analysis, and meta-analysis are very sophisticated correlational types of study. We also have to determine who participates. For all these measures, the characteristics of people who participate in the study, formerly called subjects, now called participants, are important, as is the number of people who are studied. This also is presented with statistics, numbers, that is. Of course, the experiment is the preferred method. Research methods that actually show cause and effect relationships between two variables. Those variables being independent variables that you manipulate. This variable is introduced to see what effect it has on a dependent variable, which is the second one. Dependent variables are measurements. They change as a result of whatever new condition or situation the experimenter adds. And then, of course, there's the difference between the experimental group and the control group. They're subjected to a particular treatment or condition, like specifically the independent variable, and the comparison group is called the control group. In every other way, they're treated exactly the same, except the experimental group is the one that gets the treatment. And of course, this chart just looks at how you conduct an experiment. It's worth reviewing. By the way, you can pause these videos at any time if you want to spend some time or even reverse them and listen again. Using the scientific method includes doing surveys, which involve collecting of information of large numbers of people presenting challenges to the inquiry of whether or not it's valid or not. But they're quick and easy to do. They produce answers that are influenced by the wording of and sequence of the survey questions, and for that matter, even how long they are. Studying development over the lifespan can be tricky. Typically, it's done using cross-sectional research, which groups of people of one age are compared to groups of people of another age. This can be problematic, though. Longitudinal research, collecting data repeatedly on the same individuals. So with cross-sectional, there's no control group. you're comparing and assuming that groups are equivalent, even though they may be different age and have different experiences. Whereas longitudinal studies the same people over and over and over again. So in effect, they are their own control group. And then there's cross-sequential research where we study several groups of people of different ages, like the cross-sectional approach, but follow them over a long period of time. So it's really the best of both worlds. There are some cautions from science, one of them being correlational studies. Just because something seems to cause something else doesn't mean that it actually does. So correlation may exist between two variables, even though one may not actually cause the other. Positive correlation means that the variable, when one goes up, the other goes up, or when one goes down, the other goes down. And negative correlation means just the opposite, that when one goes up, the other decreases. No correlation or zero correlation, it looks apparently that there's no connection. That's very obvious, and it typically isn't. Just remember that correlation does not imply causation. Likewise, quantitative research is a term you should know about. It provides data that can be expressed in terms of numbers such as ranks or scales. And of course, most scientists look for quantitative research. Qualitative research, on the other hand, considers quantities instead of quantities. So the qualities of the experience of having a disorder, for example, like a Down syndrome. Instead of counting how many people have it, it's looking at what that experience is like. It considers descriptions of particular conditions of participants expressed in their ideas of what it's like to have that particular condition. And then, of course, there's the entire issue of ethics. Each academic discipline and profession, including psychology and sociology, have a code of ethics, which basically is a code of conduct. It describes what you can do and what you can't do. It's not a moral code, it's a behavior code. And of course, institutional review boards assure that people follow the guidelines. If you're interested, I've put on the Blackboard page the APA's code of ethics. And maybe in one of our Zoom meetings, we could talk about ethics because they're pretty important. If you're going into nursing, there's an American Nursing Association Code of Ethics too. Participant is, for example, some of the things in the Code of Ethics is participation is voluntary, it's confidential, and you can't harm people. This is based mostly on a study that was published back in the 1970s called the Belmont Report. Research subjects must give informed consent, understand the nature of the procedure and any risks involved. That wraps it up.